For years, Equal Education and the Legal Resource Centre have been fighting the Department of Basic Education to implement the norms and standards for school infrastructure, but progress has been slow. In 2013, these organisations have visited schools in the Eastern Cape, and almost 10 years later, the schools report little improvement. The department plans to eradicate pit-latrines during the 2022-23 financial year through its Sanitation Appropriate for Education, but can it achieve in a year what they've failed to achieve in a decade? For more on this, I'm joined by Mothlabane from Equal Education and Tsukudu Moroeng from Legal Resources Centre. Very good afternoon to you both. Thanks so much for speaking to us. Allow me to start with you. Let's talk about equal education. What does equal education look for all learners?
So equal education is a movement of learners that has been fighting since its inception in 2008 for education justice, particularly in infrastructure. So we are the reason why the norms and standards were legislated in 2013, and we have been fighting for the implementation of that law through advocacy and the research that we produced that has enabled civil society movements to have a backbone in terms of the lived experiences of learners each and every day through their interaction with the education system.
So good. Now, I know you've worked with ITU in tandem, certainly for the last 10 years. Talk to us about those studies that you carried out 10 years ago on what was meant to be done, the promises that the Department of Education has made, and what progress, if any, has been made.
Good afternoon, Hugo, and good afternoon to the listeners. Yes, I mean, it's, ultimately it's a sad story. When the initial research was done in around 2013, it was found that there was serious backlogs in regards to certain categories of infrastructure, being mud schools, for example. There were thousands of schools with using pit toilets, with sanitation issues, lack of provision of water and electricity and so on. And as Moroeng mentioned, that culminated in the promulgation of the regulations in 2013. And in those regulations, the regulations are quite clear in stipulating deadlines for when all of these infrastructure backlogs were supposed to be addressed. And one of the main, there are three specific deadlines, but I'll focus on the first two, which have been missed. The first is a deadline in 2016, which is a deadline to eradicate all schools built primarily with inappropriate structures. And the second deadline is a deadline that was reached in November 2020, which was that there should be minimal schools with overcrowding. So there should be no schools with overcrowding. In other words, it should be eradicated. And there should be no schools with pit latrines. All schools should be provided with electronic connectivity, meaning internet and data, and so on. There's a whole list. And from what the data shows is that the majority of provincial departments are failing to meet all of the deadlines, or the majority of the deadlines set out in the norms and standards regulations. And this obviously means that there's a serious breach of the rights of to basic education afforded to all learners in the country.
What is the cause of this failure to meet these targets?
So,
well, if you could answer.
Equal Education has done quite a bit of research on this. And we started with the research that was produced in 2013, as Tsukudu has said, where we were visiting schools within the Eastern Cape to provide the court with concrete evidence for our case for the norms and standards for public school infrastructure. And in 2016, one of our key findings in the 60 schools that we visited was that the government was planning to fail. So they were putting forward targets that they did not have capacity to meet within the provincial departments by themselves. But the second thing, it was inconsistent data. So what you find in the report for norms and standards and public school infrastructure is not the same thing that you find in the report for a CD or NIMS report. And so that shows you clearly that even the departments themselves have not been able to survey what is the issue on the ground. And then lastly, it has been a continuous issue of the budget. Now, historically, in the Eastern Cape, we know that we've had a number of budgets being returned to Treasury because there was underspending. But fast forward to when there was COVID 2020, there was 1.7 million that was taken from the education budget that was meant particularly for infrastructure. And so the thing around budget has been a mixture of the provincial budgets not being able to spend and costing in the right way, but also education not being funded the way that it's supposed to be funded. I think also in 2018, Equal Education did a report on implementing agents, which are the middlemen who stand behind, who get money from education departments to go and implement infrastructure projects. And there is a red tape of information where information gets lost and makes projects take longer, and some contractors have not been paid on time. And so some of the contracts that we've come across, those have become one of the key issues. But I also want to highlight, as part of the mandate of Equal Education has been to push for civic participation within the government. And so we have been pushing for things like the EFMS to be made public, which is a web electronic where the ECDOE and the national government updates according to projects and what still needs to be done within the province. We have been saying that that needs to be public information, but also the initiation of steering committees within this project so that parents, learners, and LRCs are updated with regards to what's happening in their schools. So I think, to summarize, it would be building a capable state, making sure that budgets are the way they're supposed to be and costing is relevant, and lastly, data needs to reflect what's on the ground. So our education departments being in touch with the ground and what it actually looks like.
Tsukudu, the department plans to eradicate pit routines during the 2022-23 financial year. Are they just paying lip service, or is there some emboldened move that's happened in the last few months where they've realized that they can do this and they are prepared to do it?
Well, I cannot make reference to any specific factor information that indicates that there has been any progress. I think from our perspective, we've been doing a lot of litigation and court work on the provision of classrooms in certain schools. And in many of our cases, which have been reported on this news site, classrooms, the department had promised classrooms over decades ago, and these classrooms have still not been provided. And this is in the face of a court order where the court hands down an order directing the department to provide temporary classrooms in the meantime and put insufficient plans to ensure that there are permanent structures built in these schools.
So, allow me to come in there. So, in the face of a court order, budgets which are being sent back to Treasury because they're not being spent, it almost suggests that there is no desire whatsoever by the Department of Education to adhere to some of the promises that they've made. Is this a fair assessment?
I think it will be difficult to point that as the one and only reason, as there are multiple factors that play into the failure of each department to basically state what they were going to do. But one thing we can say confidently is a failure to plan comprehensively, plan properly, and implement those plans. And many of the court orders that the LRC has been able to obtain in high court litigation, in those court orders, we ask the court has ordered departments to put together a plan for the provision of this infrastructure. And in many cases, we don't get these plans, and when the plans do manage to come up, these plans are not implemented. So whether that is a lack of political will or desire is up, for the jury to decide.
Is capacity an issue? Do they have the capacity to implement and follow through on these plans? Because it certainly is one thing to come up with a plan. It's certainly another, as we have seen, to be able to implement a plan successfully.
Yes, and for sure there is capacity constraints, but I mean there's capacity constraints. There's also failure to, as Itumeleng mentioned, a failure to use funding effectively. And we all know about the irregular and wasteful expenditure. And then, as I say, there's a lack of planning, and there's also a lack of prioritization of the infrastructure, because we all know that of the little money that is sent to provincial departments to spend on things like infrastructure and stuff, that the funding that the provincial departments get is not prioritized towards infrastructure. So yes, so I would say yes, capacity, but there are, as I say, other factors, mostly from the department's part, that leads to a failure to deliver infrastructure and leads to an infringement of the rights of learners. But I think I will also defer to my colleague from Equal Education to touch on the capacity issue.
Itumeleng, before you respond to that, you've obviously done a huge amount of research on the Eastern Cape, and you haven't painted a very rosy picture of how things stand there. Is the Eastern Cape worse off than other provinces in the country?
Okay. Thank you for that. I just want to touch on the capacity issue. Look, our implementing agents report that was released in 2018 clearly cites a capacity issue within the department, because part of that report, it was to survey how the procurement happens within the department to implementing agents level and to contractor level. But you find that there is missing project managers. There's multiple directors who are taking on different work that is not within their scope. And so they definitely need to look into building a capable state within those education departments. But I do think that it's not a very hopeless picture, as I've said previously. There has been work that has been done within the Eastern Cape, particularly provision of fencing. We've seen a lot of schools, in fact, and we were hopeful that 2020 deadline around sufficient access and fencing and security of schools could have been met if the department had consistently provided those things. And this is because of advocacy that has been happening in the ground. The Eastern Cape is not a unique case of infrastructure. You look at provinces like Limpopo, who have, alongside Eastern Cape, returned funds to the education, to National Treasury just last year, when the Eastern Cape was returning 205 million. You look at the issue of sanitation, and it's not unique within the Eastern Cape, but currently Gauteng is faced with an issue of overcrowding, which speaks directly to the issue of learners getting sufficient access. So each and every province has its unique challenges when it comes to infrastructure. However, the Eastern Cape sits with the biggest backlogs, and this is not just influenced by the current administration, but also historical, the education history of how the Eastern Cape has always been positioned. And so, and also just the ideas around the things that we've been calling for that have not yet been implemented. We have been calling for sufficient use of budgets, but we saw last year 205 million being returned. So it seems like there is no consistent listening from the government and cooperation, even though we have been able to move. I'd like to cite a couple of victories that we've had, schools being built, provision of sanitation, water, and also I think fencing is a big one, because most of the schools within the Eastern Cape have, without the regard of how the school looks like on the inside, have gotten fencing, which is one of the things that we have been advocating for vastly. So it feels like there is progress, but it's slow, and that is disappointing for school communities, particularly within the Eastern Cape.
I must thank you both for your time this afternoon. Mothlabane from Equal Education and Tsukudu Moroeng from the Legal Resources Centre, putting a spotlight on the state of infrastructure in the Eastern Cape within schools.